My name is Perry Flint. I'm 36 years old, a lieutenant commander in the United States Navy. And tonight, my family was about to remind me, in front of the most powerful people in Washington, D.C., that none of that mattered. They saw my life's work as a childish phase, a footnote in the grand story of the Flint dynasty. They thought they knew everything about me. But they didn't know my other name. They didn't know the one I had earned in the shadows, the name whispered in classified briefings. They didn't know Oracle. And tonight, that ignorance was about to put everyone in danger. Have you ever felt like your greatest accomplishments were seen as insignificant by the very people who should have been your biggest supporters? If you know this feeling, press 1 in the comments. And if you believe that true strength is forged in the shadows, not the spotlight, hit that like button and stay with me, because this story is for you. The air in the grand hall of the National Portrait Gallery was thick with the scent of money, ambition, and expensive perfume. It was Politico's annual Power 100 Gala, a self-congratulatory festival for the people who shaped the nation. And I, in my crisp navy dress whites, felt like a ghost at the feast. I wasn't a guest, I was on duty, a silent node in a vast security network, my gaze sweeping the opulent room, cataloging exits, assessing threats. My mind a quiet hum of situational awareness. That hum was shattered by my father's hand on my arm. Alistair Flint, CEO of Flint Industries, a titan of construction and lobbying, pulled me towards a senator whose vote he was likely trying to buy. He held a glass of Macallan 25, the amber liquid glowing like a captured star. He smiled, a perfectly polished performance I'd seen 1,000 times. A smile for the audience. "Senator," he boomed, his voice radiating false warmth. "I'd like you to meet my youngest, Perry. She's still enjoying her little soldier game." He said the words with a chuckle, as if sharing an amusing family secret. "We keep hoping she'll grow out of it and join us in the real world at Flint Industries." A hot flush crawled up my neck. The real world. As if the deserts I'd walked and the lives I'd protected were some kind of fantasy. My mother, Eleanor, glided to his side, a queen in Chanel. Her weapon wasn't a hammer like my father's, it was a silken garrote. She touched my arm lightly, her diamonds cold against my skin. "This uniform is so sharp, darling," she murmured, her voice a soft caress that carried the weight of a judgment. "But we all know your potential is so much greater than this." Greater than this. I felt the familiar sting, the dismissal of every sacrifice, every grueling hour of training, every moment spent a world away from their comfortable reality. But years of discipline had forged a perfect mask. I smiled, a tight, polite curve of my lips, and nodded. Just then, my brother, Silas, the Harvard-educated golden boy and heir apparent, clapped me on the shoulder with a patronizing thud. "Hey, sis, you look awesome. Straight out of Top Gun." He grinned, completely oblivious. "Keep having fun. When you get tired of it, I've still got a desk waiting for you at the company." His words, meant to be friendly, were just another nail in the coffin of their perception of me. My career was a temporary diversion, a long vacation before I inevitably returned to my true destiny as a Flint. Their disdain wasn't just spoken, it was an ideology. A core belief that my chosen path was an embarrassing, inferior detour. I took a slow, deliberate breath, the way they taught us in SEAL training. In chaos, be the eye of the storm. Breathe, observe, act. The cold steel of my discipline pushed back the volcanic anger rising in my chest. I was a professional. This was just another hostile environment. And then, the environment became truly hostile. A man's voice, speaking Arabic with a distinct Levantine accent, crackled to life in my nearly invisible earpiece. It was a single, chilling phrase. "Al-Nazr al-Washk al-Hubut fi al-Ush." My blood ran cold. It was the code. The eagle is about to land in the nest. An assassination. Here. Now. In an instant, every ounce of personal indignation evaporated, replaced by the coiled focus of a hunter. The chatter of the gala faded into a dull roar. The insults of my family became meaningless noise. My training took over, my senses sharpening to a razor's edge. I ignored the senators pontificating, my father's smug smile. My eyes swept the room, not as Perry Flint, the disappointing daughter, but as Oracle. I scanned past the glittering chandeliers, the famous faces, the security details. And I found him. He was dressed as a caterer, holding a silver tray of champagne flutes. But he wasn't a caterer. His posture was too perfect, the rigid stance of a trained soldier. His hands held the tray, but his weight was balanced on the balls of his feet, ready for action. And his eyes weren't on the guests. They were fixed on the mezzanine balcony above, where Admiral Vance, my former commanding officer, was deep in conversation. The target. The nest. I didn't hesitate. There was no time for permission, no room for doubt. I moved. With a polite but firm, "Excuse me," I cut directly through the Admiral's conversation. I got close, my voice low, urgent, and stripped of all emotion. "Admiral, threat, you're 3 o'clock. Codename, Oracle. Move with me, now." Admiral Vance, a man who knew the weight of that name from a bloody campaign in the Middle East, didn't ask a single question. His eyes widened fractionally, but his body was already turning, following my lead without a word. We took 2 quick steps, turning into the narrow opening of a service corridor just as a dry, clipped thump echoed through the hall. It was the sound of a silenced firearm, almost lost in the din. It was followed by the sharp crack of shattering glass. I shoved the Admiral fully into the corridor as a chunk of marble exploded from the column right where his head had been a second ago. The bullet had found its mark, but the target was gone. I risked a glance back through the crack in the door. The scene in the grand hall was beginning to dissolve into chaos. But my focus was on my family. They stood frozen, their faces masks of naked, primal terror. The arrogance, the condescension, the casual cruelty, all of it had vanished, replaced by a raw, unfiltered horror I had never seen in them before. My father's hand was empty. His glass, the symbol of his power and status, lay in 1,000 glittering shards on the polished floor. The chaos of the gala eventually subsided into the controlled hum of a federal investigation. We were moved to a temporary command post, a sterile conference room within the gallery, now buzzing with agents in dark suits. Outside, the distant wail of police sirens sliced through the Washington night. That sound, it was a trigger. It pulled me from the present moment, from the shattered glass and the lingering scent of cordite, and threw me back 15 years. Back to a quiet, mahogany-paneled law office in Georgetown, a room that smelled of old books and leather, where a different kind of violence had taken place. I was 18, fresh-faced, and clinging to a fragile hope. It was the day of my grandfather's will reading. He was a Marine, a tough-as-nails veteran who had fought at Khe-Sanh, and he was the only person in my family who had ever truly seen me. He saw the steel under my skin, not the disappointment in my father's eyes. He was the one who taught me how to shoot, who gave me his worn copy of Marcus Aurelius's Meditations, and who quoted General Patton, saying, "Measure a man not by where he stands in moments of comfort, but where he stands at times of challenge and controversy." He had promised me 2 things: his collection of military medals, the Purple Heart, the Silver Star, and a small trust fund. Not a fortune, but enough. "Enough for you to be free, Perry," he told me, his voice raspy but firm. "Free to follow the path of honor, wherever it leads you." For an 18-year-old girl drowning in a world of suffocating expectations, that promise was a life raft. I sat in that lawyer's office, clutching the hope of that life raft, surrounded by my family dressed in somber, expensive black. The lawyer, a man with a tired face, began to read. But before he could get to the part about me, my father, Alistair, cleared his throat. He didn't sound like a grieving son. He sounded like a CEO chairing a hostile takeover. "Gentlemen," he began, addressing the room as if it were a boardroom. "My father was a sentimental man, but we must be practical." He gestured dismissively. "These old military trinkets, they would serve a greater purpose and bring more honor to his name, on display at the National Museum of the Marine Corps." He made it sound so logical, so noble. A tribute, not a theft. Then his cool, calculating gaze landed on me. And as for Perry's small trust, he continued, the word small dripping with condescension, I propose we absorb it into the main family investment fund. To leave it separate would only diminish its value. We are a family. We should act as one. My brother Silas, ever the dutiful son, nodded vigorously, his expression one of profound, borrowed wisdom. He was 22 then, already being groomed, already learning that the family's bottom line was more important than a grandfather's dying wish. I felt a surge of panic, a desperate need to speak, but my mother's hand landed on mine. It was a gesture that looked like comfort, but felt like a clamp. Her touch was icy. Perry, darling, your father is right, she said, her voice a soft, silken whisper. A young woman like you shouldn't be so fixated on the past, on war and such things. Leave that behind. Your future is here, with us. She spoke of my future as if it were a portfolio they needed to manage, an asset to be allocated for maximum return. My weak, faltering attempt at protest, but Grandpa promised, was brushed aside like a child's tantrum. I was surrounded, outmaneuvered by the people who were supposed to protect me. They weren't just taking my inheritance, they were taking my one lifeline to a world where I felt I belonged, a world my grandfather had validated. They were taking away his last gift of recognition. I tried one more time, my voice barely a whisper. It was his wish. That's when my father's patience snapped. The mask of the pragmatic CEO fell away, revealing the cold, hard man beneath. He looked directly at me, his eyes devoid of any warmth, any empathy, any love. Perry, stop being so sentimental, he said, his voice flat and brutal. Honor doesn't pay the bills in Washington, D.C. Grow up. Grow up. The words hit me with the force of a physical blow. They froze the blood in my veins and the tears in my eyes. It was a statement of their entire worldview, a philosophy so cynical and ruthless it left no room for anything but power and profit. It wasn't just about the medals or the money. It was a complete and total negation of the values my grandfather had lived and died for, the values he had tried to pass on to me. It was the moment they made it clear that the love I received from him was, in their eyes, a worthless sentiment. In that silent, mahogany-paneled room, something inside of me broke. But something else was forged in its place. A piece of ice took root in my heart, a cold, hard resolve. I didn't say another word. I didn't cry. I simply sat there, feeling utterly and completely alone. That was the day I made a decision. I wouldn't prove them wrong with words. I would prove them wrong with my life. I would build a fortress of honor and discipline so strong that their world of money and influence could never touch it. I would become so good at my little soldier game that one day my value would be something they couldn't buy, couldn't manipulate, and couldn't ignore. The wail of the siren outside the conference room faded. I was back in the present, the memory receding like a bitter tide, leaving the cold, hard truth on the shore of my mind. The battle hadn't started tonight. It had started 15 years ago, in that office. Tonight was just the first time the shots were real. My father's cold dismissal from 15 years ago echoed in the sterile D.C. conference room, a bitter reminder of the world I had chosen to leave behind. To them, my path was a foolish game. But that game had taken me to places they couldn't even imagine. My mind drifted from the polished floors of the gala, back 5 years, to a world of sand and grit. To a Thanksgiving day in Al-Anbar province, Iraq. The wind howled outside our canvas tent, a relentless, gritty scream that never seemed to stop. Inside, the air was a thick cocktail of dust, sweat, and gun oil. There were 4 of us, sitting on upturned ammo crates around a makeshift table. This was our Thanksgiving feast. We each had a foil packet from an MRE, a meal, ready to eat. I peeled mine open to reveal gray, leathery slices of processed turkey and a congealed lump of instant mashed potatoes. That was it. No pumpkin pie, no cranberry sauce, no boisterous laughter echoing through a warm, comfortable home. There was only the heavy silence of the desert, punctuated by the rhythmic crackle and hiss of the communications radio. I looked at the faces of my 3 comrades, Martinez, Chen, and Williams. Their faces were smeared with grime and exhaustion, but their eyes held a quiet understanding. They had also sacrificed a warm meal with their families, traded the comfort of home for this dusty outpost in the middle of nowhere. In that shared silence, in that moment of mutual sacrifice, I felt a bond of brotherhood deeper and more real than any connection I shared by blood. This was my family, the one I had earned. I managed to get a video call through to my family's winter home. The satellite connection was weak, the image flickering and pixelated, but it was clear enough to show me another universe. I was looking into the grand dining room of their Palm Beach mansion. A massive crystal chandelier sparkled above a table groaning with food. My father, Alistair, stood at the head, expertly carving a perfectly roasted, golden brown turkey. My mother, Eleanor, was proudly pointing out her new Tiffany & Co. dinnerware to someone off camera. My brother, Silas, a few glasses of expensive wine into his celebration, grabbed the phone. "Perry, hey!" he yelled over the noise. He panned the camera around the room, a boastful tour of their opulence. "See what you're missing, sis. Too bad you're not here. Mom's oysters Rockefeller are to die for this year." They laughed and talked about upcoming ski trips to Aspen, about the stock market, about a charity gala they'd attended. Their world was so carefree, so completely detached from mine, it felt like a broadcast from another planet. A parallel universe where I didn't exist, and my reality was an incomprehensible fiction. Eventually, my father took the phone back. He squinted at the screen, as if trying to get a better look at an exotic animal at the zoo. "Is it hot over there, honey?" he asked. "Make sure you're drinking enough water." That was it, the full extent of his concern. A generic, detached pleasantry one might offer a stranger. Then my mother leaned in. "Perry, you look so thin," she said, her voice laced with disapproval, not care. "You simply must eat more." She said it as if I were vacationing at a Spartan health spa, not stationed in a war zone. Her concern was for my appearance, a reflection on her, not for my well-being. They never asked if I was safe. They never asked if I was scared. They never asked if I missed them. They couldn't comprehend my world, and worse, they had no desire to try. The call ended. The screen went black, leaving me in the dim, dusty light of the tent, a profound and hollow coldness settling in my chest. It was in that crushing loneliness that my true work began. That night, fueled by a bitter mix of coffee and resolve, I didn't sleep. I put on my headphones and began the painstaking work of sifting through hours of intercepted communications. My ears, trained for years to filter signal from noise, were my weapon. I listened past the static, past the mundane chatter, hunting for a whisper, a nuance, a dialect out of place, and then I heard it. A garbled conversation between two men, using a rare, ancient Bedouin dialect few could understand. They spoke of a Zafat Hamre, a red wedding, and it was planned for the Darb al-Hujjaj, the Pilgrim's Road. It was code, a sophisticated IED ambush targeting a high-value convoy. The convoy of my then commanding officer, Admiral Vance. The intelligence was thin, almost non-existent. Protocol dictated I wait for more corroboration. But my gut, the instinct honed by years in the field, screamed that this was real. I bypassed the chain of command, a career-ending risk. I laundered the intel through a trusted local asset and had it fed back to the Admiral's security chief, attributed only to a new, anonymous source. Oracle. It was the first time I'd ever used the name. The convoy rerouted with only minutes to spare. A few moments later, a massive explosion ripped through the desert night, exactly where they would have been. A fireball bloomed in the darkness, a testament to the disaster that had been averted. No medals were given. No official commendations were written for Perry Flint. But a legend was born in the classified channels, the legend of Oracle. Admiral Vance knew he owed his life to that ghost, that whisper in the static, and it was a debt he would one day be asked to repay. As I stood outside the tent, looking out at the endless, star-dusted expanse of the Iraqi desert, I knew I had done the right thing. I had saved lives. And I realized, with a sad but liberating certainty, that the validation I craved would never come from a crystal-draped dining room in Palm Beach. My worth wasn't something they could measure. It had to be measured by me, alone, here in the sand. As my grandfather's book said, the obstacle in the path becomes the path. This loneliness, this feeling of being unseen. It wasn't a weakness. It was the forge, and it was making me strong. For 2 days after the gala incident, my world had shrunk to the size of a windowless, temporary office. I was buried in data streams, hunting for the ghost organization my family had brushed against, a name that kept whispering from the digital ether, Origin. The emotional solitude was familiar, a state I'd learned to operate in, but it was a heavy cloak. Then my phone buzzed. It was an unknown number, but one I recognized from its encryption signature. It was Admiral Vance's private line. I answered, my voice professionally flat. Flint. Lieutenant Commander Flint. His voice came through the line, not with the clipped authority of an admiral, but with a deep, calm warmth that took me by surprise. I know you're under a lot of pressure right now. There was a pause. My wife, Mary, is making her famous gumbo tonight. I want you at my house at 1900 hours. I was stunned into silence. He seemed to sense my hesitation. Consider it an order, Perry, he added, his tone softening even more. But not from an admiral, from a friend. An order that wasn't about duty, but about care. In my world, that was unheard of. It was a lifeline thrown into the dark, churning waters of my isolation. For the first time since the attack, I felt a flicker of light. A possibility of something other than the cold weight of my past and the threatening pressure of my present. The Vances lived in Old Town Alexandria, a historic, quiet neighborhood across the river from D.C. that felt a world away from the capital's marble and concrete power structures. Their house wasn't a sprawling mansion like the ones I grew up in. It was a beautiful, 3-story brick townhouse, steeped in history, with black shutters and a welcoming red door. The moment I stepped inside, the sterile tension of the past 48 hours began to melt away. The house smelled of old books, lemon polish, and the rich, spicy aroma of slow-cooked food. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined every available wall, crammed with books on history, philosophy, and naval strategy. This wasn't a house for show. It was a house for living and thinking. Admiral Vance's wife, Mary, met me at the door. She was a woman with intelligent, kind eyes and a smile that reached them instantly. She didn't offer a polite society handshake. She wrapped me in a warm, genuine hug. "Welcome, dear," she said, her voice as warm as the house itself. "We're so glad you could make it." Then she leaned in, a conspiratorial twinkle in her eye. "And we don't use code names at the dinner table. You're Perry here." She led me into the kitchen, where a massive pot of gumbo was simmering on the stove, filling the air with the scent of sausage, shrimp, and the holy trinity of Southern cooking: onions, bell peppers, and celery. The scene was so profoundly normal, so deeply comforting, it felt almost surreal. There was no judgment in the air, no silent calculation of my worth. There was only peace, knowledge, and the quiet promise of a good meal. We sat down at a simple wooden dining table, and for the next 2 hours, not a single word was spoken about the investigation, the attack, or my family. It was an unspoken, compassionate agreement to give me a sanctuary. Instead, Admiral Vance, or James, as he insisted I call him, told me about his last fly-fishing trip to Montana, his eyes lighting up as he described the fight a rainbow trout put up. Mary, a retired history professor, discovered my love for ancient history and launched us into a spirited debate about Hannibal's tactics during the Second Punic War. She argued with the passion of someone who lived and breathed the subject, treating my opinions with a respect I rarely received even from my peers. They asked me about the books I was reading. They asked me where I dreamed of traveling after I left the Navy. They asked me about me, the person behind the uniform, behind the code name, the person my own family had never bothered to get to know. And I found myself talking, truly talking, for the first time in years. I heard myself laugh, a real, unforced sound that felt foreign and wonderful. In that cozy dining room, over bowls of rich, dark gumbo, I felt something I hadn't realized I was starving for. I felt seen. When it was time to leave, the Admiral walked me to the door. We stood for a moment under the soft glow of the porch light. "Perry," he said, his voice now serious, carrying the quiet authority I knew so well. He looked me straight in the eye. "What you do in the shadows, it has shaped history in ways the newspapers will never write about. Don't you ever let anyone tell you otherwise." My throat tightened, a knot of emotion I couldn't swallow. It was the validation I had spent a lifetime chasing, delivered so simply, so directly. He wasn't finished. "And remember this," he said, placing a hand gently on my shoulder. "This door is always open. This family is always here. This family." The words were a balm on wounds I didn't even know were still bleeding. It was more than an offer of shelter. It was an offer of belonging. It was the antidote to a lifetime of poison. I walked out into the cool DC night. The city was the same, the darkness was the same, the threat I was facing was still very real. But I was different. I was no longer an island. I was no longer alone. And that changed everything. The warmth from my dinner with the Vances lingered for a few hours, a fragile shield against the cold reality of my work. It was a borrowed piece, and like all borrowed things, it had to be returned. By morning, the comforting memory was gone, replaced by the harsh, clinical blue light of a computer screen. I was back in the windowless room that served as my command post, a mole burrowing through mountains of data. The world had shrunk again to this single, obsessive point of focus: hunting. With the quiet, unofficial support of a small, trusted team loyal to Admiral Vance, I was digging into the labyrinth of shell corporations and financial cutouts surrounding the attack. And one name kept surfacing like a body in a swamp, a ghost in the machine: Origin. On the surface, Origin presented itself as a bland, utterly forgettable logistics consulting firm. Its public face was a study in corporate camouflage. But the deeper I dug, peeling back the layers of digital misdirection, the more it looked like a venomous octopus. Its tentacles were a complex web of phantom subsidiaries and holding companies, reaching into the sun-drenched secrecy of the Cayman Islands and the anonymous banking havens of Panama. It was an empire of shadows, built to move money and assets without a trace. Its website was a monument to minimalist evasion, a blank wall offering no information, no names, no history, only a single, unsettling logo. It was 3 stylized V's, interlocked in a sharp, aggressive geometry that resembled a bat's wings in mid-flight or perhaps a 3-pronged spear. The image was hypnotic in its stark simplicity, and it burrowed into my mind, a symbol of something sleek, predatory, and deeply, fundamentally wrong. A cold knot of dread, an instinct honed in the deserts of Iraq and the back alleys of the Middle East, began to tighten in my stomach. This was the feeling I got just before an ambush, the silent alarm that screamed when a situation was dangerously wrong. Trusting that gut feeling has kept me alive more than once. I used the ongoing security audit of the gala as official pretext and requested full access to my father's temporary office and all his materials from the conference. It was a long shot, a desperate search for a single needle in a haystack of his own making, but I had to know. His temporary office wasn't just a room. It was a statement, a luxury suite at the Willard with a sweeping panoramic view of the Washington Monument. It was a perch of power. Stacks of glossy brochures and strategic plans for Flint Industries lay on a polished mahogany desk, testaments to my father's relentless ambition. I sifted through them, my movements methodical, my mind a cold, analytical engine pushing down the rising tide of filial guilt. Then, tucked into a leather-bound portfolio, I saw it. It was a draft of a strategic partnership agreement between Flint Industries and a European partner, a company called Viridian Group. I'd never heard of them. The document itself was dense with legalese, pages of standard, boring corporate jargon. But as I flipped to the final signature page, my blood ran cold. There, in the bottom corner, faint as a watermark and almost invisible to the naked eye, was the logo. The 3 interlocking V's. Origin. My heart hammered against my ribs. The air left my lungs in a silent rush. For a full 10 seconds, the world tilted on its axis, the sounds of the city outside fading into a muffled roar. My eyes darted to the margin of the page. There, in my father's sharp, impatient handwriting, was a brief, damning note, scrawled in black ink. Confirm press credentials for their delegation. Silas to handle. Silas to handle. The paper trembled in my hand. A wave of dizziness and nausea washed over me. The sniper. The sniper had used a forged press pass to gain entry to the gala, to secure a vantage point, a clean, unobstructed shot. And this note, this single sentence scrawled by my father, it was the missing link. The key. My father, blinded by his reckless ambition or driven by something far worse, and my brother, in his eager, thoughtless obedience, had greased the wheels. They had personally provided the cover, the very credentials, for the man who tried to murder the Admiral, the man I was sworn to protect. The casual, lifelong contempt they held for my career was no longer a private family drama, a source of quiet pain and resentment. It had bled out of their gilded world and into mine, metastasizing into a clear and present danger to national security. An icy rage, cold and sharp, sliced through the initial shock. But right behind it, nipping at its heels, came a wave of pure, primal fear. If my father was involved, even as an unwitting pawn in their sophisticated game, then the enemy wasn't just some shadowy organization across the ocean. The enemy was close. The enemy had a key to my childhood home. My hands shook as I pulled out my secure phone, my fingers fumbling with the keypad. My mind was a whirlwind of denial, frantically trying to find another explanation, a plausible coincidence, anything to refute the terrible, treasonous conclusion forming in my head. I typed Viridian Group into a deep web search engine. The search results loaded with agonizing slowness, an article from a European financial journal, a dry press release about a new acquisition, and then an image. It was a photo from a high-profile charity golf tournament at Mar-a-Lago, taken a few years ago. In the bright, unforgiving Florida sun, my father stood beaming, his hand clasped firmly around the hand of a smiling Middle Eastern financier, a man whose face I knew from intelligence briefings. He was on a U.S. sanctions watch list for his suspected ties to funding extremist groups. Their shared smile was a sickening portrait of easy camaraderie between powerful, unscrupulous men. And standing just behind them, slightly out of focus but chillingly unmistakable, was another man. He wore a quiet, serpentine smile, and his face was one I now recognized from the bare-bones employee roster I'd managed to pull on Origin. It wasn't a coincidence. It wasn't a mistake. The time for denial was over. This was a network, a web of power, money, and terror, woven between the golf courses of Florida and the war zones of the Middle East. And my father, Alistair Flint, was standing right in the center of it, shaking hands with the spider. I felt the floor drop out from under me. The CIA has an old, cynical saying for dealing with accusations. Admit nothing. Deny everything. Make counter-accusations. I was facing masters of that dark art, but this wasn't a game anymore. This was a betrayal so profound, so absolute, it threatened to shatter everything I thought I knew about my life, my family, and the very country I had sworn to defend. The floor of my father's office felt like it had dissolved into nothing beneath me. The photo from Mar-a-Lago burned in my mind, a toxic image of betrayal. A primal instinct, a screeching alarm in my soul, told me I was exposed, that the war had just followed me home. I didn't think. I just ran. I bolted from the Willard, leaving the investigation and the protocols behind, and raced through the D.C. traffic toward my apartment in DuPont Circle. I had a backup hard drive there, paper files from my time in the Middle East, evidence, my own personal insurance policy. The entire drive, my mind was a repeating loop of a single, desperate prayer. Please let me be wrong. Please let this just be paranoia. But the moment I saw my front door, I knew I wasn't wrong. There were faint, fresh scratches around the lock, almost invisible to a civilian eye, but to me, they screamed forced entry. My heart hammered against my ribs as I pushed the door open. The violation was chilling in its precision. This wasn't a smash and grab. My laptop was still on the desk, my jewelry untouched in its box. This was a professional job. They had tossed the place, but methodically, searching for something specific. It was clear what they'd taken. My spare hard drive was gone from its hiding place, and a file cabinet containing my old paper records from the Middle East campaign stood open and empty. They had stripped me of my proof. But that wasn't what made me freeze. That wasn't what stopped the air in my lungs. It was what they left behind. On my coffee table, placed dead center in the room, was a single photograph. It was my favorite picture in the world. Me, at 22, beaming with pride on the day of my Naval Academy graduation. My grandfather standing beside me. His arm was around my shoulder, his own face, weathered and kind, lit up with a joy that outshone the Maryland sun. It was a perfect moment, a sacred memory of the one person who always believed in me. And they had taken a knife to it. A single, deep, vicious slash ran across the photograph, cutting through my grandfather's smiling face. A deliberate, hateful act of desecration. It was a message. And just to make sure I understood who sent it, lying beside the ruined photo was a single paperclip, twisted carefully, malevolently, into the 3V logo of Origin. This wasn't a warning. This was a declaration of war on my soul. They knew my pressure points. They knew what would hurt me more than any physical threat. They didn't just want my silence. They wanted to break my spirit. They wanted to show me they could reach into the most sacred corners of my heart and defile them. The disciplined calm I'd spent a lifetime cultivating shattered. The anger I had suppressed for years, at my family's condescension, at their dismissals, at their cold, transactional view of the world, erupted like a volcano. This was their world. This was the result of their deals and their greed. They had crossed the final line. They had put their filthy hands on my grandfather. My own hands were shaking with a rage so pure it felt like electricity. I snatched up my phone and dialed my father. He answered on the second ring, his voice clipped and annoyed. "What is it, Perry?" "They broke into my apartment," I said, my voice trembling with fury. "Your new business partners. They were here. They desecrated Grandpa's picture." The words felt like acid in my mouth. There was a long, cold silence on the other end of the line. I could hear his breathing, measured and controlled. Then he spoke, and his voice was not that of a concerned father, but of a chairman annoyed by a junior employee's incompetence. "Perry, you're being dramatic," he said, his tone dripping with impatience. "This is the world of big deals. There are risks involved. You chose your path. Deal with the consequences yourself. And stay out of my business." He hung up. The dial tone buzzed in my ear, the sound of ultimate betrayal, the final door slamming shut. He didn't just dismiss my fear, he blamed me for it. He confirmed in that one cold, cruel statement that I was on my own. I slid down the wall and crumpled onto the floor, the phone slipping from my grasp. I felt utterly broken, adrift, betrayed by my enemies and abandoned by my family. I stared at the ruined face of my grandfather, and for the first time since I was a child, hot tears streamed down my face. Tears of grief, of rage, of profound, bottomless loneliness. But as the tears subsided, they washed away the grief and left something else in its place. Something hard and cold and clear. A resolve of pure, unyielding steel. My hand reached for the one thing my grandfather had left me that they could never take. His worn copy of Meditations. Tucked inside, yellowed and creased with age, was a single sheet of paper I had printed out years ago. It was a passage from a speech by Theodore Roosevelt, "The Man in the Arena." I pulled it out. And in the wreck of my apartment, I began to read the words aloud, my voice starting as a whisper but growing stronger, harder, with every line. It is not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood. Have you ever had a moment where a final line was crossed, a moment that turned all your pain into pure, unbreakable strength? If you have, press 9 in the comments. And if you believe it's time for the person in the arena to fight back, hit that like button. I read the final lines, my voice now a low, steady vow. I stood up, wiping the tears from my face with the back of my hand. The pain was still there, but it had a new purpose. It was fuel. All right, I whispered to the empty, violated room. They want a war. They'll get one. In their arena. The grief in my apartment had crystallized into something else entirely. Cold, hard purpose. The tears were gone. The victim was gone. There was only the mission. I was no longer acting as Lieutenant Commander Perry Flint, bound by the Navy's rules of engagement. I was now Oracle, and my rules were my own. Know your enemy and know yourself, and you need not fear the result of 100 battles. Sun Tzu's ancient wisdom, studied at the academy, had never felt more relevant. It was time to know my enemy. I picked up a sleek, featureless burner phone from my go bag and opened a heavily encrypted messaging app. I scrolled to a single contact, a name I hadn't used in years. Castle. He was a ghost, a former NSA signals intelligence prodigy who had been forced into early retirement after a botched operation in Yemen. I had been the one to find the data that proved he was the scapegoat, not the cause. It was enough to save his pension and his reputation. I had never called in the favor, until now. I typed a single, simple sentence. Castle, I need a key for a locked door. I'm cashing in my chit. The reply came back in less than 10 seconds. The usual place, 1 hour. In my world, loyalty and old debts were a currency far more valuable than anything my father could comprehend. The usual place was a dimly lit, perpetually crowded coffee shop in Adams Morgan, a neighborhood known for its transient population and noisy nightlife, the perfect place to be anonymous. The air smelled of burnt coffee beans and damp wool. I found Castle hunched over a laptop in a dark corner booth. He looked older, grayer, the stress of a life in the shadows etched onto his face, but his eyes were still as sharp and restless as a hawk's. He didn't waste time on pleasantries. He didn't ask what I was into or why. He understood the rules. He simply slid a tiny USB drive across the scarred wooden table. This is a custom worm program, he said, his voice a low murmur that was easily lost in the cafe's chatter. Plug it into any device on their internal network. It'll sniff out any file encrypted with the specific quantum algorithm that firms like Origin favor. It won't break the encryption. That's next to impossible. But it will flag the files, clone them, and send the copies to a secure dead drop I've set up for you. You only get one shot. Once the worm is in, it'll erase itself in 60 seconds. He stood up, pulling the collar of his coat high. As he turned to leave, he paused. Oracle, he said, using the old name with a hint of warning. Be careful. These kinds of doors are often booby-trapped. I pocketed the USB drive. It felt heavy in my hand, a small piece of metal that held the key to either my victory or my destruction. My first weapon was secured. Now I needed the ammunition. With a quiet call to Admiral Vance, I was granted full, unrestricted access to all the security and surveillance footage from the night of the gala. For the next 36 hours, I barricaded myself back in my windowless command post. The world outside ceased to exist. My only companions were the hum of the servers, the glow of a dozen monitors, and the bitter taste of black coffee. I was fueled by caffeine and a cold, disciplined rage. I became a ghost in their digital machine, replaying every moment from 100 different angles. I tracked the sniper's path through the service corridors. I analyzed the flicker of his eyes, the subtle shift of his weight. I cross-referenced every face in the crowd against intelligence databases. But the real breakthrough came from the audio logs. I isolated the sniper's burner phone and began the painstaking process of tracing its call history. Hours of static, dead ends, and misdials. Then, at 3:14 a.m., I found it. A single, 7-second call made an hour after the attack. A call from the sniper's untraceable phone to another number. A number that wasn't untraceable at all. It was a prepaid cell phone registered under the name of a junior administrative assistant at Flint Industries, my brother's assistant. There it was, the final damning piece of the puzzle, the direct, undeniable link. I now had the motive, a strategic partnership. I had the means, a press pass issued by my family's company. And now I had the connection. A direct phone call between the triggerman and an employee under my brother's command. The picture was complete, a chilling mosaic of greed, terror, and betrayal. My mind, now operating with the icy precision of a battlefield commander, shifted from intelligence gathering to strategy. How to deploy this weapon. A quiet report to the FBI. A confrontation behind closed doors? No. That was their way of doing things. Burying the truth in sealed files and non-disclosure agreements. My father and his associates thrived in the shadows. I was about to drag them into the light. I pulled up the schedule for the final day of the conference. There, listed as the keynote speaker for the closing gala, was my father, Alistair Flint. He would be giving a speech on legacy and integrity in modern American business. And beneath his name, in bold letters, was the event's primary sponsor, Origin. Their 3V logo would be projected onto a massive screen right behind him as he spoke. That was it. That was the arena. My heart beat a slow, steady rhythm. There would be no private phone call, no tearful, angry confrontation in a sterile office. I would use their stage, their audience, their symbols of power against them. I would turn my father's moment of ultimate triumph, his speech on legacy, into a public trial of his own. The plan formed in my mind, cold, precise, and unstoppable. It was time to remind them what my little soldier game had taught me. It had taught me how to fight, and it had taught me how to win. The grand ballroom of the Willard Intercontinental Hotel was glittering with manufactured prestige. It was the closing gala of the conference, and the air was thick with power. Senators, CEOs, lobbyists, and journalists all mingled under the cavernous, ornate ceiling, their forced laughter echoing off the crystal chandeliers. This was my father's natural habitat. This was his arena. And tonight, I was stepping into it. From the shadows at the back of the room, I watched him take the stage, Alistair Flint in his element, radiating confidence. He stood at the podium, a portrait of success. Behind him, on a massive screen, the sleek 3V logo of Origin, the event's sponsor, glowed like a malevolent eye. He launched into his keynote address, his voice smooth and practiced, speaking of legacy, integrity, and the future of American enterprise. The hypocrisy was so thick I could almost taste it. I saw my mother and brother, Silas, sitting at the head table, their faces glowing with pride. They were oblivious, basking in the reflected glory of a man they thought they knew. They had no idea the carefully constructed world they inhabited was about to be leveled. I stood perfectly still, my navy dress whites feeling less like a uniform and more like a suit of armor. I took a slow, deep breath. My heartbeat was a steady, rhythmic drum. This is not revenge, I told myself. This is a course correction. This is a truth alignment. Alistair was approaching the crescendo of his speech, his voice booming with feigned passion. It is our duty, as leaders, to build a legacy not just of profit, but of principle. That was the cue. From the side of the stage, a figure emerged. Admiral James Vance, in his full-dress blues, his chest adorned with rows of ribbons, stepped into the light. A ripple of confusion and surprise went through the ballroom. The polite chatter died instantly. All eyes turned to the stage. My father stopped mid-sentence, his mouth slightly agape. He stared at the Admiral as if he were an apparition. Admiral Vance walked calmly to the second microphone. He didn't look at my father. He addressed the silent, watching crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, my apologies for this interruption," he said, his voice a steely baritone that commanded absolute attention. "But there is a story of courage that needs to be told tonight. A story about the unseen battles that define the true character of this nation." He spoke of the Middle East. He spoke of a critical convoy, an imminent IED ambush, and a single, ghostly piece of intelligence that had saved the lives of 24 American service members. He spoke of the quiet heroism of an operative known only by a code name: Oracle. He described the intellect, the sacrifice, the incredible pressure of making life-or-death decisions from half a world away, with no expectation of recognition or reward. The room was captivated, hanging on his every word. My father stood frozen at the podium, his own speech forgotten, a prisoner on his own stage. The Admiral paused, letting the weight of his words settle into the silence. 2 nights ago, he continued, his gaze sweeping across the powerful faces in the audience. Here in this city, in an attack that has been kept from the press, Oracle saved my life again. A wave of murmurs broke out across the room. A hand shot up from the press section. It was a senior reporter from the Washington Post, already smelling a major story. "Admiral Vance," the reporter called out, his voice sharp with professional urgency. "Who is Oracle?" Every phone in the room was now up, recording. Every camera was pointed at the stage. The glare of the lights was blinding. This was the moment, the fulcrum on which my entire life was about to pivot. Admiral Vance held the crowd in a moment of suspended animation. He didn't answer the question. He simply turned his head, slowly, deliberately, and looked directly toward the back of the room, directly at me. It was the signal. I stepped out of the shadows. The spotlights found me, and a collective gasp went through the ballroom. I walked down the center aisle, my heels clicking a steady, resolute rhythm on the marble floor. I didn't look at the shocked faces of the Washington elite. I didn't look at the flashing cameras of the press. I didn't even look at Admiral Vance. My eyes were locked on one person, my father. I walked to the edge of the stage, stopping just a few feet from him. He stared at me, his face a mask of disbelief, his mind clearly struggling to process what was happening. The smug confidence had been replaced by a dawning, sickening horror. For the first time in my life, I saw fear in his eyes. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. In the dead silence of the Willard Ballroom, my voice was clear, cold, and carried to every corner of the room. I held his gaze and delivered the final, fatal blow. It wasn't an accusation. It wasn't an explanation. It was simply a fact. The daughter you underestimated. Absolute silence, a stunned, breathless vacuum that lasted for 3 full seconds. Then, the explosion. Not a bomb, but 1,000 camera flashes going off at once. A blinding, deafening volley of clicks and strobes. The sound of a reputation, a legacy, and a family dynasty shattering into 1,000,000 irreparable pieces. My father's carefully constructed facade of power and integrity had just been publicly and permanently demolished. The flashbulbs from the Willard Ballroom seemed to echo for days, a phantom lightning storm in my memory. In the immediate aftermath, the world outside my apartment became a raging tempest of headlines and 24-hour news alerts. My face, my name, my carefully guarded code name, they were everywhere, splashed across every screen and newspaper in the country. "Oracle, the Navy's ghost hero," screamed one headline. "Flint Industries implicated in assassination plot," declared another. "Politico Gala shaken by revelations as daughter exposes titan of industry." The fallout was swift, brutal, and exactly what I had engineered. Trading of Flint Industries stock was immediately halted on the New York Stock Exchange, its value plummeting in after-hours markets. The FBI, no longer operating in the shadows at my behest, launched a full-scale, highly public investigation into both my father's company and the phantom entity known as Origin. The glittering empire my father had spent a lifetime building, a monument to his ego and ambition, was beginning to crack and crumble under the weight of the truth. I watched it all unfold from the quiet, controlled sanctuary of my apartment. I had turned off my personal cell phone, a necessary act of self-preservation against the inevitable flood of calls from reporters, stunned old acquaintances, and curious friends. I kept only a single, secure line open, my sole connection to the official world I still served. In the silence, a profound and boundless sense of relief washed over me. It felt as if a mountain I'd been forced to carry on my back my entire life, a crushing weight of expectation and disappointment, had finally been lifted and cast aside. The truth was out. I was, in a very real way, free. But as the days passed and the initial adrenaline of the confrontation faded, a different feeling crept into the silence. A hollow, echoing emptiness. It was the quiet, lingering grief for the family I'd always wished for. The family I now knew. with absolute and final certainty, I would never have. The victory was clean and strategically perfect, but it wasn't painless. Winning the war meant accepting the casualties, and the primary casualty was the fantasy of a loving family I'd clung to for far too long. A few days into my self-imposed isolation, the secure line buzzed, its sharp, electronic sound cutting through the quiet. The encrypted caller ID read, Silas. I hesitated for a moment, my thumb hovering over the screen. Then, with a steadying breath, I answered, my voice deliberately neutral. Hello, Silas. The voice on the other end was one I barely recognized. The smooth, confident, perpetually patronizing tone of my older brother had been stripped away. In its place was a man who sounded lost, scared, and years younger. His words tumbled out in a panicked, disjointed rush. Perry, Oh God, Perry, I'm sorry, he stammered, his voice cracking. I swear to God I didn't know. I had no idea what any of this was about. Dad just told me to process the credentials for a new European client. That's it. It was just paperwork, a routine request. I never would have. Are you okay? It was the first time in my adult life I'd ever heard a single, unadulterated drop of sincerity in his voice. This wasn't a performance. He was genuinely terrified, a man whose gilded cage had just been revealed to be a prison. And the bars were beginning to close in. For a fleeting second, I felt a pang of pity for him. But pity was a luxury I couldn't afford. As the psychologist Brené Brown wrote, clear is kind, unclear is unkind. It was time for absolute clarity. I'm fine, Silas, I replied, my voice calm, but with a new, unmistakable distance in it. The emotional armor was back in place. But your feelings don't change the facts. You have a choice to make, right now. You need to decide which side you're on, the side of the truth or the side of Dad's lies. I didn't wait for an answer. I didn't need one from him. The choice was his to live with, his consequence to bear. I ended the call. I had drawn the first boundary. The next call, a day later, came from Admiral Vance. His voice was grim but steady, a reassuring anchor in the storm. Your father was brought in for questioning by the Bureau this morning, he said, skipping the pleasantries. Publicly, he's stonewalling, admitting nothing, denying everything. Classic Alistair Flint. The Admiral paused, and I could hear him take a breath. But he gave them something off the record. A name. The name of Origin's primary intermediary in Europe. He didn't confess, Perry, but he chose a side. I processed his words, my analytical mind kicking in. It wasn't an apology. My father was too proud, too pathologically arrogant to ever offer one. It was a cold, calculated move of self-preservation, a bargaining chip to save himself. But it was also something more. It was the only way a man like him could concede defeat. It was his silent, grudging admission that my world, the one of intelligence and unavoidable consequences, had finally proven to be more real than his. It was his acknowledgement that I had been right. It was a victory, but it tasted like ash. The final communication from the House of Flint came a week after the gala. It was an email from my mother. It was long and rambling, a masterclass in narcissistic manipulation, expertly disguised as maternal concern. She wrote of her shock, her pain, her own sacrifices for the family name. She painted herself as the ultimate victim in this tragedy, a loyal wife blindsided by events she couldn't possibly comprehend. The email ended with a sentence designed to weaponize guilt and pull at the old strings of familial obligation. Family needs to stick together in times of crisis. You should come home. I read the words, and for the first time, her attempts to guilt me felt powerless, like a ghost rattling chains that were no longer attached to me. The old wounds didn't ache. I just felt a deep, profound pity for her, a woman so trapped in her husband's gilded world that she couldn't see the truth even when it was a national headline. I thought about what family really meant. It wasn't blind loyalty to a lie. It was showing up, telling the truth, and offering a safe harbor, like the Vances had for me. My reply was short, clear, and final. I typed, I agree. Family does need to stick together. That's why I'm having dinner with Admiral Vance and his wife tonight. I hope Dad tells the FBI the whole truth. I hit send, the click of the mouse a small decisive sound in the quiet room. The boundary was no longer a line in the sand. It was a fortress wall, built of truth and self-respect. It was clear, it was kind, and it was non-negotiable. The war for my own worth was over. The long, quiet work of defining my own peace had just begun. 2 weeks after the world turned upside down, I found myself running along the banks of the Potomac River. The sun was just beginning to rise, painting the sky in soft shades of pink and orange, its light glinting off the calm gray water. The air was cool and crisp against my skin. This had been my routine for years, a discipline forged in the punishing pre-dawn hours at the Naval Academy. But today, something was different. For the first time, my rhythmic breathing wasn't a technique to control stress or manage anger. It wasn't a tool. It was just breathing, the simple, steady cadence of life itself. My feet hit the pavement in a comfortable, easy rhythm. I wasn't running from anything anymore. I was simply running towards the new day, towards a future that was, for the first time, entirely my own. My grandfather, though not a particularly religious man, used to quote a line from the Bible, "And you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free." I used to think freedom meant the absence of struggle. I realize now that wasn't it. Freedom wasn't the absence of pain. It was the absence of the prison that pain builds around you. I had spoken the truth, and it had unshackled me. I looked out at the glittering water and felt a sense of peace so profound it was almost startling. In that moment, I forgave my family. Not because they had earned it, or even because they deserved it. I forgave them because I deserved to be free from the weight of my own anger. It was a gift I was finally giving to myself. I slowed to a stop near the Lincoln Memorial, stretching my legs, my breath coming in easy clouds in the cool morning air. And then I saw him. A solitary figure was standing by the water's edge, staring out at the river. Even from a distance, I recognized the set of his shoulders. It was my father. He looked smaller, defeated. He wasn't wearing one of his immaculate, custom-tailored power suits, just a simple windbreaker and slacks. He looked like he had aged a decade in 2 weeks. His shoulders, which had always been squared with arrogance and authority, were slumped. He turned, as if sensing my presence, and his eyes met mine. For a long, awkward moment, neither of us spoke. The silence was thick with everything that had been said and everything that never would be. The river flowed on, indifferent to our broken history. He was the first to break the silence. His voice was raspy, a shadow of its former booming confidence. He didn't look at me, but at the reflection of the rising sun on the water. "Your grandfather," he began, his voice cracking slightly. "He would have been proud of you." It wasn't an apology. It would never be an apology. But it was more than I had ever expected. It was an admission, a concession, acknowledgement, and strangely, it was enough. I just nodded, a single, small movement. I didn't need anything more from him. My own self-worth was no longer a cup I needed him to fill. He continued, speaking almost to himself, his words carried away by the gentle breeze. You always breathed so steady, even when you were a little girl. You'd fall off your bike, scrape your knee, but you wouldn't cry. You'd just get up, take a breath, and get back on." There it was. The recognition I had craved for a lifetime, spoken in a clumsy, broken, and tragically late confession. He had seen me all along. He had seen the steel, the resilience. He had just chosen not to value it. "You should go, Dad," I said softly, my voice devoid of anger. "The FBI might be watching." He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. He turned and walked away, a man who had lost his empire, but who, perhaps, in the ruins, had just found some small, forgotten piece of his soul. I watched him go, then turned back to the river, feeling a quiet sense of closure. 3 days later, I found a plain white envelope in my mailbox. No stamp, no postmark, no return address. My instincts went on high alert. Inside, there was no letter, just a single playing card, the Joker. Pasted across the card were words cut from newspaper headlines, a classic, theatrical threat. Oracle, a new game has begun. A year ago, this would have sent a jolt of fear through me. Today, I felt nothing but a calm, steady resolve. The threat didn't destabilize me. It only confirmed what I already knew. The world was a dangerous place. The fight was never truly over. Origin's network may have been damaged, its leadership exposed, but it wasn't dead. An organization that powerful, that deeply embedded, doesn't just disappear. It mutates. It regroups. But so had I. With a calmness that had become second nature, I slipped the card into a clear evidence bag from my kit. This time, I wasn't fighting to prove my worth to my father or to anyone else. I wasn't fighting for a seat at a table where I was never wanted. I was fighting because this is who I am. The game may be new, but the player is not. And Oracle is always ready. And so, Perry Flint's story comes not to an end, but to a new beginning. I want to personally thank you for following her journey with us. Her transformation from the underestimated daughter to the master of her own arena is a powerful reminder that our truest strength is the one we find within ourselves, forged in our own silent battles. If stories of resilience, justice, and the courage to set boundaries resonate with you, I invite you to subscribe to the Chosen Revenge channel so you don't miss the next journey. Let us know in the comments, what part of Perry's story gave you the most strength? We read everyone.